Welcome to Webinar Wednesdays, brought to you by Georgia IPL and Hoosier IPL. Thank you for sharing your lunch hour with us and for your curiosity and commitment to creation care. I'm Reverend Kate McGregor Mosley, Executive Director of GIPL, and I'm based in Atlanta. And we're also joined by Dr. Patricia Tull of Hoosier IPL, and she's based in Indiana. This is the second in a series we're calling The Spirit is Willing and We Are Not Faint. These webinars are happening these 3 weeks in May. Today's webinar is entitled Creating Social Movements for Change. In last week's presentation, Dr. Tull shared with us new insights on biblical texts to help reimagine humans' relationship with God's creation. This week, we dive deeper into what moves us forward in faithful action by actually looking back into history once again. We certainly hope this webinar sparks many ahas for you, and if so, you'll find at the top of this webinar on the right our contact information, both for myself and for Tricia. You'll see our email, our website address, as well as our Twitter handle. So please keep in touch and let us hear your questions and reflections on today's presentation. Once again, I'd like to also offer my thanks to GIPL's Road Fellow and Episcopal intern, Demarius Walker, for working on last week's recording and making sure we're all set for this presentation today. And now I wish to introduce to you once again the Reverend Dr. Patricia Tull. Currently, Tricia works as the program director for Hoosier Interfaith Power and Light. She recently retired from her teaching post at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. And I invite you to take some time to explore her book entitled Inhabiting Eden: Christians, the Bible, and the Ecological Crisis. You will find that it provides thoughtful study and exploration of the scriptures for guidance on the environmental challenges we face today, especially how those challenges relate to our relationships with other living beings, both human and non-human, and of course, how it impacts our relationship with God, our Creator. Tricia, we await an eager anticipation for the sharing of your wisdom and further insights as to how people of faith can engage in impactful change for the sake of all creation.
Thank you so much, Kate. Last week, I introduced the webinar series by discussing the crucial place of faith communities in our efforts toward creation care today. While all ancient faiths seem to share important perspectives on our place in creation, I focused on the Christian Bible and especially the Hebrew scriptures, not only because I have expertise here that I don't have in the same way for other ancient scriptures, but also because it is interpretation, or often misinterpretation, of the Hebrew scriptures that has uniquely influenced American culture. I discussed perspectives on our place in the natural world reflected in ancient scripture that seems to have been lost in recent times, as well as a key misinterpretation of Genesis 1's passage about dominion that has contributed greatly to our environmental disconnect in recent centuries. I then introduced 5 ancient claims derived from scripture that together contribute to a moral basis for creation care. The first webinar is available at both the Hoosier IPL and Georgia IPL websites, but on this slide you can see a very quick preview of these ancient claims. They involve the value of creation for its own sake, the intimate connections between social and environmental violence, the interests of future generations, the importance of environmental justice, and implications for the ways people of faith might fruitfully conduct our lives and our efforts. Today, I want to talk about how we grow within ourselves and among ourselves the qualities that make for social change. I'll begin with the concept of metamorphosis and examine its scientific and scriptural dimensions. Then I will examine stories from our own history that help us consider such transformations, perspectives on the radical nature of the transformation, and finally, personal character traits that I believe contribute to strong and healthy social transformation. Much of what is difficult about the climate crisis is that it is unprecedented in the Earth's history. Humans have had the capacity to destroy parts of the Earth all along, even in ancient times. but the global scale of the current destruction has never been approached before. This puts people trying to mend the world in the position of making it up as we go along. In fact, one of the most daunting pieces has not been understanding the science or developing the technology, but making the human changes, transforming our society and our norms. Much as we need to move forward, we find ourselves beset by inaction. So where do we find the tools to change? One weekend last year, I was preaching and teaching at United Church in Chapel Hill. The day was brimming with significance, not because of me, but because of surrounding events. It was Transfiguration Sunday. It was also the weekend of the annual Interfaith Power and Light preach-in on climate change, and that was why I was there. The day before, a Moral Monday march in Raleigh had featured the fiery preacher Bill Barber speaking out for economic and environmental injustice. And as if the planned events weren't enough, Chapel Hill had just been devastated by the brutal murder of 3 Muslim students. It became evident to me that weekend that despite appearances, all those narratives jostling together were not separate dots with empty space in between, but rather they were points on an interconnected web of alarm about the way we humans live. I had planned to preach on Genesis 9, God's first covenant after Noah's flood, which God iterates and reiterates over and over, is a covenant not with humans alone, but with all the earth's creatures. But the liturgical place of Transfiguration forced me to think also about Jesus' story. Now, I have to admit that Jesus' Transfiguration has always left me bewildered. A story where Jesus gets shining clothes and dead prophets talk to him, and then all this disappears and things are back to normal. The only part that didn't seem strange was the disciples' bewilderment, which was pretty close to my own. But as I thought about all that was going on, all the ongoing human violence against one another and against the earth, I saw something different about Transfiguration. This is what I noticed. That when the Apostle Paul says to the Romans, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds," and when he says to the Corinthians that we are being transformed into God's image, Paul uses the exact same Greek word that Matthew and Mark use to describe what happened to Jesus on that mountain, a word that occurs in the New Testament only in those 4 places. And even though it's Greek, we know this word from science class. Metamorpho, metamorphosis, a miracle that happens every day. It's in the DNA of some insect larvae to be transformed into butterflies and moths. What the use of this Greek word in relation to humans seems to imply is that it's also in our DNA to be transformed, to become stronger and more beautifully than we originally found ourselves. Caterpillars are transformed by the complete restructuring of their bodies. Jesus was transformed, or to be more exact, he was seen that day by his disciples as he had been all along. We people, we sinners, are transformed by the renewing of our minds and the restructuring of our societies as we grasp who we were meant to be. We are meant to undergo metamorphosis, to grow into the likeness of God. We are meant to shine. Social transformation may seem unlikely, yet we know it's exactly what we need. Considering some precedents might help us think about the present. I remember as a child being inspired by biographies of courageous people. I assumed that I too would become the kind of person I was reading about. I assumed we all wanted to grow up to be great. I would test myself against these stories. Would I have the clarity to oppose slavery or the courage to hide Jews? Such stories are not just about the dead. Those of us old enough to remember the 1960s know that the majority of white society was moved to change racist American structures within a short time, in the same decade that we were also moved to environmental protection, the same decade that widespread anti-war movements began. All three of these movements remained incomplete 50 years ago, and in many ways we have backslidden since. But they continue to inspire action now. My own specialty is the book of Isaiah, more specifically the parts of the book that arose at a critical turning point in the history of ancient Judah, the end of the Babylonian exile in the 6th century before Christ. In the year 587 BCE, the city of Jerusalem had been obliterated by Babylon's army, destroying a royal dynasty that had lasted 400 years, destroying Solomon's temple, and apparently destroying the future of Judah, both for those who remained in the devastated land and for those who were forced to leave. Crisis hit on every level, from personal tragedy to social unraveling to religious undoing, loss of faith in Judah's God. But within 50 years, Babylon was defeated by Cyrus of Persia. The reality under which most people had lived for decades was once again gone forever, and a new reality was born. This posed a different kind of threat, since now Judah could have simply dissolved into the Persian Empire as many other small countries did. The fact that Jerusalem was instead rebuilt and repopulated was no foregone conclusion. Without the creative imagination of a few and the will to act on it, Judah would not have survived, Jerusalem would not have been reborn, Judaism would not have emerged, no worshippers of Judah's God would have remained. They would have spawned no Jesus, no Christianity, and no Islam. Development of three faiths that together are now claimed by more than half of the Earth's 7 billion people depended on the creative imagination of a very small group, dozens at most, whose names we don't even know. I want to point out an element of the creative imagination of one preacher of Jerusalem's restoration, the prophet who preached, "Comfort, comfort my people," the part of Isaiah that begins with chapter 40. We don't know this person's name. We can't even be sure if the prophet was a man or a woman. For convenience, scholars call this exilic poet Second Isaiah. What Second Isaiah used to fire imaginations about the future was not just plain history, but a particular way of shaping the memory of certain events. Not because they perfectly fit the current situation, but because they offered a template of hope. In chapter 43, Second Isaiah speaks words in God's name that have enormous resonance today. "Do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name, you are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and the flames shall not consume you." The prophet never denies that the people will encounter dangers, and but asserts that they will prevail in the midst of them. Then the prophet says something very odd, paradoxical in fact. "Thus says the Lord, who makes a way in the sea, a path in the mighty waters, who brings out chariot and horse, army and warrior. They lie down, they cannot rise. They are extinguished, quenched like a wick. Do not remember the former things or consider the things of old. I am about to do a new thing." These words recall the deep past, the story of the nation's origins at the Red Sea, when God delivered their ancestors, escaping slaves, from the Egyptian armies. God made a path in the mighty waters for the Hebrews leaving Egypt, but the chariots, horses, armies, and warriors of their pursuing enemies were destroyed, quenched like a wick, as Second Isaiah says. Yet oddly, Surprisingly, after that elaborate introductory reminder of the past, the prophet veers into a different direction, saying, "Do not remember. Forget about that, because what is happening now is something new." Here is how the prophet goes on to describe it. "I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. The wild animals will honor me, the jackals and the ostriches, for I give water in the wilderness, rivers in the desert, to give drink to my chosen people." The prophet's forceful order to forget is ironically hedged about with powerful remembrance echoing the old story, defying amnesia. What does the prophet propose that could possibly displace Judah's originating narrative? It's a new thing, not a way through the sea, but a way through the wilderness. Not dry ground in the waters, but waters on dry ground. Second Isaiah's analogies between the two events, in fact, magnify the present one, since it reenacts, as it were, not only the ancestors' safe passage through the dangers of the sea, but also afterward God's provision of water for them in the wilderness. The new waters the prophet envisions will be even greater than the old ones, since they will quench the thirst not only of the people, but also of wild animals, jackals and ostriches. In this new salvation, as the prophet envisions it, the land itself is restored. This strategic evoking of memory claims that what is new and unprecedented is in another way not really new after all, but was implicit in Judah's story all along. The new situation, a desert rather than a sea, has brought forth God's old mighty deeds in new ways. Here, "do not remember" becomes a call to loosen Judah's grip on things as they were and to expect something new, yet not utterly new if examined closely. What we see here is ancient recognition of the great power of the past to feed and fund imagination in the present. The past doesn't have to perfectly align with present needs. In fact, it won't. But it can still give us enough to go on if we remember it skillfully. Social transformation seems so unlikely, and yet we know it's exactly what we need. Let's talk about more recent precedents and see how they help us think about the present. The environmental crisis presents a seemingly unimaginable break from things we have always known. Last week, I talked about some of the role of consumerism in our lives and its challenge to the gospel of simplicity. Like the Judeans, who had lived their entire lives in exile, we too have a certain way of life that for us constitutes the way things are, even when we don't like some of it. Specifically, our society is so engrossed in being consumers that we have largely lost our citizenship. So it's instructive to look to moments when our ancestors called courageously into question the world as they had always known it, not just in ancient Judah, but in the more recent past. One of these is the story of the abolition of British slave trade around the turn of the 18th century by a small group of Christians and one not too liberal English politician, William Wilberforce. If you saw the 2006 movie Amazing Grace, you know this story. Here you can see the actual minutes of the first meeting of that band of Christian idealists who approached Wilberforce, asking him to lead legislation to abolish slave trade. At this time, British economy had been relying on slavery and the slave trade for 2 centuries. That's twice as long as we have relied on automobiles today. It took him 5 years to introduce the bill, and when he did, it was roundly defeated. He was ridiculed, as in this cartoon, in words that sounded Strangely familiar today, he was called unpatriotic, disloyal, and insensitive to the economic needs and even the international security of Britain. Slave trade as a source of energy and wealth was as entrenched then as fossil fuel is today. Few white people could imagine Western civilization functioning without it. Wilberforce introduced the bill every year for the next 16, and in the meantime, he and others worked hard to change public opinion by publishing slaves' own autobiographies, offering tours of slave ships, and putting manacles on display. Knowing that laws are founded on public opinion, and public opinion is founded on laws, they worked both ends of the spectrum. And suddenly, in 1807, by a vote of 283 to 16, the British slave trade was rendered illegal. It's a lot like the seismic shifts we've been seeing very recently. Slow to start and breath-stopping when the endgame comes. Amazing grace. Such social transformations do not begin without a few people, like Second Isaiah, and like Wilberforce and his supporters, stretching to imagine a different world and persisting courageously to bring it about. But these transformations do occur, and when they do, that is human metamorphosis, transfiguration in action. It's easier to consider the radical metamorphosis needed now when we remember that such metamorphosis has happened many times before, and in fact, in various ways, is happening before our eyes today. Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, subtitled Capitalism versus the Climate, which is about as comprehensive of a verses as we can imagine today, is a well-researched, readable assessment of the game changer that the climate crisis is for everything about our current economic system. Klein argues that the climate crisis did not fundamentally come about because ordinary people are too selfish or foolish to change our lives. Rather, she says, we are caught in a system we didn't make, a system bigger than we are, a system that must be stopped. Recycling alone won't save us. Guilt about our individual carbon footprint is a red herring. Things have gone awry, and to quote Abraham Heschel, few are guilty, but all are responsible. We have not done the things that are necessary to lower emissions, Klein says, because those things fundamentally conflict with deregulated capitalism, the reigning ideology for the entire period we have been struggling to find a way out of this crisis. The actions that would give us the best chance of averting catastrophe are extremely threatening to an elite minority that has a stranglehold over our economy, our political process, and most of our major media outlets. When Klein seeks models for the dramatic social change needed now, she too looks to the abolitionists, saying a transition as large as the one confronting us today has happened before, and indeed it is remembered as one of the greatest moments in human history. I want you to notice this, where this handbill says the outrageous abolitionist of the most revolting character is speaking at a Presbyterian church. What would happen to our imaginations and actions if we were to apply Second Isaiah's strategic recall of somewhat parallel past movements like abolition to our crisis today? I've found myself lately reading slave narratives to understand more clearly the systems of exploitation that characterize both chattel slavery and environmental waste, their underlying violence, and what it takes to stop them. Frederick Douglass's remarkable story, and then Solomon Northup's gripping 12 Years a Slave. The partnership between blacks and whites, that is, the witness of slaves to their own experience, and the amplification of their message by white abolitionists powerfully undermined slavery's moral authority. Today, just as white abolitionists amplified the personal witness of black slaves, white Americans and white Protestants can reach across lines of race and culture to amplify the voices of people who, because of where they live, understand better than we do what's going on. Here are some interesting statistics for anyone who still thinks that environmental defense is a white person's pastime. A report jointly prepared by PRRI and the American Academy of Religion shows that Americans still rank climate change last on a list of important issues. What's more, the overall population is relatively unconcerned about their personal impacts from climate change. But these overall statistics hide a very interesting set of details. Among Latinos and Blacks, these numbers are rather different than they are among whites. While less than half of white Americans are concerned about the impact of climate change, the numbers rise steeply among non-white populations. Nearly 6 in 10 Blacks and more than 7 in 10 Latinos are worried. In other words, non-white populations, even in the climate-denying U.S., already recognize what many whites are not yet seeing. Reinforcing this pattern, when we examine climate change concern by religious affiliation, the Hispanic Catholic population is the most concerned group, and the white Catholic population is the least concerned. Yet, white Catholics stand only a notch behind white mainlines and neck with white evangelicals. Black Protestants are more than a third again more likely to be concerned than white Protestants are, and Hispanic Catholics outconcern white Protestants by almost double. Here's more. Hispanic Catholics and Black Protestants are twice as likely to hear about climate change from the pulpit as white mainlines, and 4 times as likely as white evangelicals and Catholics. Clergy of color are speaking out, and Americans of color are getting it. It's whites who are behind. At the Climate March in Washington, D.C. 3 years ago, I heard the hip-hop preacher, the Reverend Lennox Yearwood, say it well. He compared the march that day to the one 50 years before, the March on Washington, in which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. articulated his dream of racial equality. Reverend Yearwood said, "They marched for jobs and freedom and for equality, but this rally is more important than that rally then. While they were fighting for equality, we are fighting for existence." In an even more surprising turn, First Nations tribes in North America still have relevant land rights from treaties made with Canadian and U.S. authorities or their British predecessors centuries ago. With legal support, these documents become tools to stop extraction on vulnerable lands in the western U.S. and Canada, Nova Scotia, and elsewhere. Wherever rights-rich but cash-poor Indigenous people make common cause with cash-rich but rights-poor U.S. and Canadian citizens, they find unique power to overturn extraction plans. Indigenous environmental movements are growing and networking all over the world, from Arizona to Hawaii, Australia, South America, and Africa. The 2007 UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted by 147 member countries. Indigenous rights, Klein says, if aggressively backed by court challenges, direct action, and mass movements demanding that they be respected, may now represent the most powerful barriers protecting all of us from a future of climate chaos. Beyond these 2 strategies, of drawing on parallel stories from the past and drawing on partnerships with people who are more in the front lines than many of us are, I want to suggest 3 personal qualities that we might each do well to cultivate. The first of these qualities is curiosity. I say this because every time I say to myself about something, there must be a better way, and every time I pause to find out whether someone else indeed thinks there is, whether someone somewhere is modeling that better way, the answer is always yes. On this, I am Google search's best friend. Someone somewhere is doing what we wonder if it's possible. I'll give you a minor example. Several years ago, the bushes behind our house were infested with aphids. We tried various traditional pesticides, and all they did was to add to the damage. In desperation, we searched the internet for an alternative, and we discovered an organic soap manufactured less than 100 miles from our home in Indiana that cleaned up the problem in a single season, and we've been aphid-free and chemical-free ever since. More importantly, we learned organic methods work. Curiosity helps with everything from how to make fine household cleaning products from vinegar and water to how to think differently about the global economy. It has helped me when I felt trapped in realities I hated participating in but didn't know how to exit. And over time, it has helped me mentally chart the growth of preferable systems and to celebrate them. Theological ethicist Cynthia Mo Libeda describes the growing inconsistency of our present form of capitalism with both democracy and Christian ethics, critiquing from the viewpoint of faith the poor economic choices we often find ourselves offered as unknowing or unwilling participants in systems that damage both humans and nature. Where can one afford clothes that are justly made? She asks. What can we do about the presence in cell phones of materials that are funding human slavery and violence in Congo? The stories that she tells are tragic, but the alternatives she describes lend hope. So first, let's cultivate the curiosity to find things out and seek alternatives. The second quality is especially important for people of faith. Moral clarity means, first, knowing what faith and ethics teach. Second, comparing what faith teaches with what is actually going on today. And third, articulating the distinction, both in words and in actions. People of faith draw moral clarity first from our religious tradition. Those of us in Abrahamic religions draw especially from the values of creation, love, and justice that our ancestors articulated so long ago. If we have such values firm in our minds, we can pinpoint just how some systems controlling our world are neither normal, nor just, nor survivable. In last week's webinar, I named several understandings from biblical tradition that can offer focus and clarity. This moral clarity may be drawn from a specific tradition, but it is affirmed by the witness of religious traditions from around the world that likewise value justice over greed, community over individual, patience over hurry, self-control over other control, and flourishing of all over dominance of a few. This moral clarity, as we live it out, is reconfirmed as we see where these principles and actions are actually working. It draws from developing sensitivities and appreciations congruent with human flourishing in a flourishing world. And it also draws from grief, the great sadness that we do well to recognize within ourselves when we hear about yet another creature going extinct, yet another pipeline spill, yet another society's poisoning or displacement, yet another majestic place destroyed. It draws from recognition that we can't sit still and watch others suffer. These recognitions won't come to us through network news or programming or through any corporate-controlled media. They come through curiosity as we seek information about our world, both in alternative news sources and in our own encounters and experiences. These recognitions nourish a different sense about what is wrong and hostile to Earth's flourishing and what is right and normal. Besides curiosity and moral clarity, a third quality to cultivate within ourselves in support of social transformation is courage. This is what God advised for Jacob. Do not be afraid. What the prophet 2nd Isaiah said to the Judeans, do not fear. What Jesus said to several people in his lifetime, take heart, do not be afraid, take courage. My son is a school teacher, and he uses a neighboring word to describe what Dominican children of immigrants in Harlem's Washington Heights need to succeed in school. He calls it grit. Let's use both words to reinforce the power of each. Courage comes in the action, not a moment before, or perhaps a split second before. Courage that isn't acted on will wither. Courage enacted multiplies. Grit is marathon courage, courage that doesn't give up. The way the Apostle Paul describes grit in 2 Corinthians could well describe the fight of courageous people throughout history who hold on to their humanity and their moral clarity even in the face of opposition. He describes the enormous human potential for courage in dangerous times. His words remind us that we are a long, long way from giving up. Courage is like muscles, making what was once harder easier to do. At Hoosier Interfaith Power and Light, we offer a workshop for faith leaders that we call Climate Boot Camp to equip religious leaders to speak out on climate change. A climate scientist, a Baptist minister, and I lead it together. Last fall, one of the participants said that broaching climate change from the pulpit was very hard. He only did it because he had committed to. But since then, he said, it has come up several times, and every time it's easier. Courage comes with practice, and it is drawn from the great community of others around us, learning from their examples and working together. These are the small things that grow in each of us that transform the world: curiosity, clarity, and courage. Nurturing these qualities and surrounding ourselves with a great cloud of witnesses, we can not only envision a future that differs from the present, but also take action to help usher it in. The Central Hills of Kentucky are well known as the locale of Gethsemane Abbey, the Trappist monastery where Thomas Merton lived. Several orders of nuns reside nearby. One Tuesday in December 2013, the Dominican Sisters and Associates of Peace, the Loretto community, and the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth hosted an interfaith prayer ritual to publicize an energy vision statement. They had written it in response to the proposed construction of a natural gas pipeline across central Kentucky. The issue had come into public news in August, when the Sisters of Loretta and the Trappist Brothers of Gethsemane denied access to those wishing to survey for this new, flammable, pressurized natural gas liquids pipeline. Over 125 organizations and 1,000 individuals signed on to the Energy Vision Statement, which said, in part, we stand with all those who oppose the widespread risks to natural ecosystems and human well-being caused by the rush to achieve national energy independence through the creation of vast infrastructures for the extraction, refinement, and combustion of more fossil fuels. We urge instead the development of national policies and infrastructures that will facilitate a swift and steady transition to renewable energy sources. We commit ourselves to use our spiritual and social resources and our public credibility in all possible ways to promote the transition from fossil fuel energy to renewable energy resources. As a result of their leadership, citizens of Central Kentucky were galvanized to halt the pipeline. They sought and ultimately obtained a judicial ruling that such utilities could not invoke eminent domain to seize the land of those unwilling to take the risks of leakages and explosions that the pipelines posed. Other pipelines will be pushed in Kentucky and elsewhere, but the sisters and citizens demonstrated that curiosity, clarity, and courage can turn the conversation around. These can not only save precious land and people, but help surrounding communities think through the issues before it's too late. Psychologist Mary Pfeiffer describes the growth in Nebraska of opposition to the Keystone XL pipeline, from a very small group to a statewide and then a nationwide debate. Their movement brought unlikely allies together. Suddenly, Pfeiffer says, urban progressives were drinking coffee in the kitchens of Holt County ranchers. Republican farmers were attending strategy meetings at the headquarters of Bold, Nebraska Political Action Group. I once heard Roger Gottlieb talking about what's great about being an environmentalist today. Prominent on his list was the many fine people you meet along the way. We can see these movements as many little dots growing, perhaps isolated at first, until they spread and converge and change the face of the world. We don't have to work alone. We can draw courage from the great cloud of witnesses from before us and from the amazing partnerships we are finding now. Thus strengthened, we can take our place at this unprecedented time in a vast movement to transform human society. I hope that what I am saying has inspired you to anchor yourself in courageous stories from our past and to think about specific ways that you can step up this week to build curiosity, moral clarity, and courage as you actively work with others in your community to transform this crisis and be transformed through it. Next week, we'll talk about our hopes and sources of hope as we shift to a flourishing future. Thank you so much.